Buenos días. Como decana de la Facultad de Geografía e Historia de la Universidad de Sevilla, les doy la bienvenida en nombre del equipo decanal de nuestra facultad a todos los presentes, ponentes y estudiosos del Congreso Internacional organizado desde el Departamento de Prehistoria y Arqueología de nuestra facultad, titulado Coastal Sanctuaries in Tarteso, Turdetania. Agradezco a sus organizadores que hayan contado con la facultad y, antes que nada, paso la palabra en primer lugar al profesor Antonio Sáez, que será quien más o menos comente en qué consiste este magnífico congreso.
Buenos días, buongiorno, morning. Me toca hablar en nombre del trío de coorganizadores. Lo primero, evidentemente, darle las gracias a las autoridades académicas presentes en este acto de inauguración, a la señora decana María Antonia Carmona, al director del departamento, al profesor García Fernández, que además también hará las veces de ponente. Y bueno, también comenzar agradeciendo a las instituciones y a los proyectos que han hecho posible que estemos aquí hoy y que vayamos a disfrutar de estas dos jornadas hablando de santuarios en el Mediterráneo. Iba a decir en el suroeste, pero en el fondo se habla un poco de todo el Mediterráneo. Por una parte, y sobre todo, al proyecto Tarteso Olvidado en los Museos 2.0, redes urbanas y versus paisajes rurales, dirigido por los profesores García Fernández y Ferrer Albelda, al Vicerrectorado de Investigación de la Universidad de Sevilla por la concesión de la ayuda al plan propio de esta anualidad, al proyecto Vestigium, Arqueología y Paleobiología Intermareal, dirigido por las colegas del Instituto Andaluz de Patrimonio Histórico Milagro Alzaga y Eloisa Bernaldez, y bueno, cuyos resultados pues, se expondrán también en esta jornada, y también a la propia Facultad de Geografía e Historia por la cesión de este espacio para la celebración del evento. El Congreso, bueno, pues tiene, digamos, su foco puesto sobre un tema largamente debatido, con muchas reuniones previas, digamos que está de moda últimamente, muchas reuniones en los últimos meses o próximas a celebrarse. Bueno, era desde luego un tema central, ¿no?, en el análisis de las comunidades prerromanas peninsulares y su interacción con el Mediterráneo. En este caso ponemos el foco en los santuarios litorales, la religiosidad marítima y en sus particularidades, tanto en la ubicación y características de los propios centros de culto como en los indicadores materiales de la práctica ceremonial, en los ritos, en las vocaciones, en el carácter poliédrico, ¿no?, de estos centros como puntos de reunión, de encuentro, de actividades políticas, económicas, de muchas facetas. Fueron evidentemente usados, interpretados de muchas maneras estos centros, esas divinidades que habitaban a ojos de los antiguos, ¿no?, en esos centros. Y bueno, en este caso nos vamos a centrar en la problemática sobre todo del suroeste peninsular durante el primer milenio antes de la era, pero como bien saben por el programa, pues digamos trataremos de encuadrar eso en el marco del Mediterráneo, ¿no? Es decir, que con el ojo puesto en las orillas de aquello que convencionalmente llamamos Tarteso y posteriormente Turdetania, pues intentaremos insertar, digamos, esa dinámica regional en el ámbito mediterráneo. Es un enfoque sobre un tema clásico, pero que creemos que es novedoso en el sentido de que la orientación ha sido a integrar no solo aproximaciones histórico o arqueológicas más tradicionales, sino también pues, el componente, digamos, del análisis del paleopaisaje, de la evolución de la costa, del nivel del mar, de la incidencia de eventos de alta energía, y cómo eso, digamos, ha modelado no solo la topografía, sino también el sentir y el hacer de las comunidades que habitaban en esta época, ¿no?, la región. Si dan un vistazo al programa, verán que vamos un poco, en principio, de lo general a lo particular, de lo mediterráneo y de grandes síntesis hacia Occidente, hacia esa región que nos interesa, Hay una amplia participación de colegas internacionales, vienen de Italia, de Alemania, de Francia, de Polonia, de Portugal. Y bueno, yo aprovecho para agradecerles el enorme esfuerzo de haber hecho hueco en la agenda, porque todos sabemos cómo vamos todos. Y bueno, es fantástico contar con su presencia, ¿no? El evento, evidentemente, se divide en 2 jornadas, como hemos dicho. La primera, pues empezamos, como decía, desde lo más general a lo particular. Pasamos del enmarque mediterráneo al caso de la bahía de Algeciras, y luego terminaremos con una serie de ponencias marco centradas en estos aspectos más de carácter paleogeográfico, ¿no? Y el análisis de la incidencia del medio sobre los santuarios y la religiosidad. El segundo día, un poquito más intenso en el horario, pues empezaremos con otra ponencia marco, con otro tema transversal, ¿no? Como es el aprovechamiento de los recursos y su relación con las prácticas rituales y demás de los santuarios, y luego iremos caminando hacia los bloques dedicados a la bahía de Cádiz, al caso de la desembocadura del Guadalquivir y al extremo occidental del Golfo de Cádiz, ¿no? El caso de Huelva y del sur del actual Portugal. El cierre, yo creo que como no podía ser de otro modo, o al menos esa ha sido nuestra perspectiva, lo pondrá el colega Francisco Núñez con una mirada otra vez hacia Oriente, en este caso hacia la Madre Patria, hacia Tiro. Nos hubiera encantado poder complementar las jornadas con una jornada más, en este caso una salida de campo, ir a visitar los sitios, pero bueno, quizás no era aconsejable por la época del año, ¿no? Y la climatología tan cambiante que tenemos. Estos sitios evidentemente tienen una problemática específica, ¿no? En cualquier caso, bueno, pues digamos, agradecer otra vez a los ponentes su presencia, agradecerle al resto de asistentes también su participación, animarles a una participación activa, ¿no? Aprovechar esta pléyade de ponentes nacionales e internacionales. Y bueno, yo en nombre de los 3 organizadores, pues decirles que esperamos que sea en días intensos, de mucho debate, mucha discusión, de mucho intercambio científico, pero también que sea el encuentro, pues las jornadas, un punto de encuentro multicultural y demás, que sea pues como eran los santuarios en la antigüedad. Y nada más.
Muchas gracias, Antonio. Tiene la palabra el profesor Francisco José García Fernández, director del Departamento de Prehistoria y Arqueología.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Bueno, normalmente cuando se me invita a abrir este tipo de actos en representación del departamento, pues suelo mantener ciertas distancias, ¿no?, con el acto y hacer una presentación institucional, básicamente para dar la bienvenida y dar las gracias. Teniendo en cuenta que formo parte del mismo grupo de investigación, que codirijo el proyecto, uno de los proyectos que da origen a este encuentro, que participo mañana en una ponencia y que encima os conozco a prácticamente todos los ponentes, mi presentación no puede ser formal. Así que lo siento, pero os voy a dar una calurosísima bienvenida. Os voy a agradecer enormemente en nombre del departamento, pero también en nombre de mis colegas del grupo de investigación, vuestra participación y vuestra asistencia, con el deseo de que podamos pasar mucho tiempo juntos, que es lo mejor de los congresos, el poder pasar tiempo juntos y hablar, no solo aquí, sino hablar ahí abajo entre nosotros y compartir conocimiento. Y además voy a aprovechar para dar la enhorabuena a los organizadores por haber colocado en el calendario tan apretado que tenemos de congresos siempre a principios de año, esta actividad de elevadísimo nivel y de un interés, como ya sabéis, prioritario, ¿no?, para la investigación, no solo en la Universidad de Sevilla, sino en las universidades andaluzas y en general de todas las universidades de las que vosotros procedéis, ¿no? En ese sentido, se suele, ¿no?, este año, en otoño, la comitilla suele ser que hay muchos congresos sobre Tarteso. Bueno, nunca es suficiente. Por muchos congresos que haya sobre Tarteso, nunca es suficiente, porque la cantidad de datos y la cantidad de enfoques que se están abriendo, desde luego, dan para varios eventos y para varias miradas sobre esta cuestión. Si el alumnado que asiste va a pensar que por fin en este congreso nos vamos a poner de acuerdo, pues lamento decirle que no. Es un spoiler, no nos vamos a poner de acuerdo. No hay suficientes congresos y en ninguno nos vamos a poner de acuerdo. Pero yo creo que la clave está en que a través de esas discusiones y a través de esas distintas miradas que vamos planteando encuentro tras encuentro, se están abriendo nuevas perspectivas y se están dando a conocer interesantísimos datos que, más allá del enfoque sobre el cual, o del prisma sobre el cual midemos el mundo tartésico, desde luego están permitiendo dar un salto cualitativo sobre el conocimiento de esta cultura, civilización, región, gente, cosas que vivían en la Baja Andalucía, Extremadura, Galicia, sur de Francia, o donde se encuentren los límites de Tarteso, pero que en cualquier caso es un síntoma de la salud, de la buena salud que tienen los estudios sobre protohistoria, no solo en la península ibérica, sino en general en las universidades que trabajamos en Italia, en Francia, en Portugal, sobre estas cuestiones. Y un síntoma de buena salud académica el que nos encontremos tantas veces y nos permitamos el lujo de discutir sobre estas cuestiones. Así que, como os dije, no iba a hacer una presentación formal y básicamente lo que os doy es la bienvenida y las gracias a todos.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a los dos. Y bueno, pues yo me voy a reiterar, pero muchas veces es bueno repetir las cosas porque cuando se repiten es cuando se sienten. Y realmente quiero agradecer de nuevo la celebración de este congreso en nuestra facultad, especialmente a los organizadores, que no se ha dicho el nombre de todos, se ha dicho Eduardo Ferrer, Albelda, Antonio, Manuel Sáez Romero y Carmen Ramírez Cañas, que tiene que estar por ahí también. Que, bueno, pues gracias a vosotros por contar con la facultad para el desarrollo de este interesante encuentro que permite dar visibilidad a todas las facultades también, vuestras investigaciones, la calidad que tienen esas investigaciones y las conexiones con diferentes universidades de todo el mundo. Por lo tanto, enhorabuena por la iniciativa. Sé muy bien lo complicado que es normalmente organizar un congreso y, por lo tanto, este especialmente lo es por la envergadura que tiene, que son 2 días, es muy intenso lo que van a tener, una cantidad bastante notable de intervinientes y, además, el hecho de diferentes universidades, diferentes lenguas. Por lo tanto, bueno, pues eso complica un poquito la cosa. Pero realmente el programa es muy intenso, es muy interesante y los títulos que he leído muestran esa categoría de todos los investigadores que tiene, las reflexiones que hay, los contrastes que va a haber. Por lo tanto, puedo asegurar que va a ser todo un éxito y les felicito, por lo tanto, ya de antemano. Y no me voy a alargar más, puesto que tienen por delante unas largas jornadas de estudio y debate. Saben que cuentan con la facultad para todo lo que necesiten y solo me queda darle de nuevo la bienvenida con el deseo de estas jornadas sean muy fructíferas y gratificantes. Así que, sin más que decir, queda inaugurado el Congreso. Welcome, benvindo, benvenuti, bienvenidos.
Bueno, buenos días. A mí ya sabéis que no me gusta, los que me conocéis, hablar en público, pero bueno, tengo que hacerlo. Entonces, simplemente para reiterar el agradecimiento y para la presentación del profesor Pablo Schela. Él no necesita presentación en los estudiosos del mundo fenicio-púnico. Yo lo consideraría como casi uno de los padres de la investigación sobre religiosidad o religión fenicio-púnica, y no creo que requiera más presentación. Así que, sin robarle ni un minuto más de su tiempo, pasamos a la primera conferencia, la conferencia inaugural, que es Text, Iconography and Identity, Phoenician-Punic Deities in the Mediterranean.
En primer lugar, agradezco a los organizadores por esta invitación y después permítame recordar aquí María Giulia Amadasi Guzzo, quien tanto hizo por estos estudios y dedicar este discurso a su memoria. progress made in the knowledge of past cultures occurs through various processes and circumstances, of which two basic ways can be identified. On the one hand, there is a conditional progress, strictly depending on increased documentation. On the other hand, there is an unconditional progress, which is achieved through the application of new theories and methods to already acquired data. In our case, in spite of some documentary increase, the second way largely prevails. Taking both these aspects into account, I offer here a concise overview of Phoenician and Punic deities and cults, with a couple of important premises which underline the difficulties of this task. It will be an unsystematic review, consisting of methodological remarks and selected examples aiming at internal consistency of my discourse. Talking about Phoenicians, their cults and deities, means using definitions that are still at the core of a lively debate and cannot be taken for granted. As is well known, Phoenicians and Punics are not internal self-denomination, but external labels coined by others. No national consciousness is attested by internal sources, but possibly a limited political awareness, perhaps more significant in the Levant, with its territorial kingdoms, than in the West, in the plethora of settlements of the so-called Mediterranean diaspora. Phoenician never existed. It has been argued with sometimes serious, sometimes humorous arguments. Now, jokes aside, one cannot deny the existence of few but strong common elements, first and foremost the language, and the tendential homogeneity of beliefs in terms of cosmology and conception of superhuman entities. All these authorize us to think them as belonging to a substantially shared cultural sphere. Precisely as other ancient Mediterranean peoples, Phoenicians had their own worldview that did not distinguish the religious sphere as we do. Instead of a more or less codified and detectable religion, they possessed complex tradition characterized by their own conceptual categories. It was a Weltanschauung that encompassed not only cosmogony and cosmology, but also the political, social, and economic dimension into which we use to divide reality. Physical and human world in all its aspects had their foundation in deities and their actions. However, we must also agree on what we mean by God. For us, strongly influenced by the classical legacy, the concept deity is clear, at least in general. A superhuman being, conceived as endowed with extraordinary powers, not subject to death, the object of cult and prayers, conveyed on the cosmological and anthropological level. Its powers are unlimited in the case of monotheism, partially shared with other superhuman figures in the case of a plurality of characters. But this approximation already makes it difficult for us, for example, to relate the Phoenician and generally Northwest Semitic term El to Sumerian Akkadian Dingir, Egyptian Nesher, Greek Theos, Latin Deus, etc. I mean, our traditional human-divine opposition already fits poorly or not at all with the vision of other cultures. In general, as far as polytheistic deities are concerned, we might be tempted to imagine them as static entities, similar to stickers in a collector's album, each photographable in a sort of personal card, Aphrodite, goddess of love, Ares, god of war, etc., stiffed in stereotyped images, always the same and exportable everywhere. Of course, it's very different, and much more in polytheism than in monotheism. In this case, the stiffening of the only divine figure, which becomes omnipotent, and for this very reason, almost impersonal, is the endpoint of a long historical process. For their part, polytheistic deities are symbolic systems characterized by complexity and a surprising dynamism. They have a shaping and reshaping identity according to times, place, social context, traceable in the dimension of myth and cult, where the needs of their devotees are expressed. Consequently, grasping a definitive aspect of it turns out to be a chimerical undertaking. The name of a god or a goddess may be little more than a summary label. It's beyond it that the identities culturally conferred to this bearer must be sought from time to time, from place to place. In this direction, recent wide-ranging research has drawn new attention to the importance of divine epithets, showing, for example, that topographical elements are massively mobilized in the divine onomastics. I refer here to mapping gods. In any case, it's essential to establish also conventionally what we meant by God and divine. In the Greek word, for example, are the heroes excluded? Yes. Should characters like Imhotep, the deified Egyptian architect and physician, be included? I don't know. How do Syrian-Palestinian Rephaim, Rapiuma fit in? We now have a detailed repertoire from which to start for historical analysis in the true sense. In fact, the risk one runs is to remain at the level of cataloging without avoiding that the divine figures becomes reified, losing sight of the fact that it's always, everywhere, and in any case, a human cultural product that exists only in the mind of the person who conceives and projects it, in space and in time. It has been remarked that, I quote, the god on the corner, the protector of the village, the god of the vicinity are figures extremely present in the everyday life, much more than the big international stars of the divine system. End of the quotation. The most important question to ask is, are these really differentiated figures, or are they autonomous manifestations of the same big international divine star that multiplies in his or her infinite potential to cover human needs and requests? It's not easy to give an answer. As for our sources, all what has been remarked so far has an immediate consequence for our approach. In general, there are no sources which are religious in itself, except, of course, those of a cultic type. But all evidence must be taken into consideration in order to reconstruct Phoenician supernatural entities. Strictly archaeological sources, cult places, iconographic documentation, inscription, and indirect written sources of all kinds. The iconographic field deserves a special mention. Beyond an inevitable degree of stereotypicality, the possible polyvalence of the same image, the iconographic documentation is theoretically invaluable for visualizing how one decides to represent a certain divine figure, choosing become a wide range of possibilities and details. Unfortunately, our panorama is quite disappointing. Let's leave aside non-Phoenician deities who enjoyed the cult and of whom we have depictions, such as some Egyptian gods like Ammon, Bastet, Bes, Harpocrates, Hathor, Horus, Isis, Osiris, and so on. Or some Greek and Roman deities like Apollo, Demeter, Poseidon, Triton, Pluto, Mercury, etc., venerated in later times in the Punic world. Instead, let's pay more attention here to the list of Phoenician and Punic deities for which we have one or more depictions that, with a greater or lesser degree of certainty, reproduce them. Astarte, Melkar, Baal-Ammon, Tinit, Baalat-Gubal, Baal-Shamem, Reshef, Anat, Shadrapha, Sid Sardus Pater, Iolaos. As can be seen, Eshmun is missing, and even for some other deities, the identification is at best very hypothetical. But even at a cursory glance, it's clear that we find nothing revolutionary in these images, compared to what can be deduced from textual and archaeological sources. For example, Baal-Ammon is depicted as a wise elder gentleman on a throne. Tinit looks like a mother goddess. Astarte is a sexy symbol, mostly related to fertility and fecundity. And the Phoenician Melkart is, so to speak, absorbed into the iconography of Heracles. A little interesting surprise is perhaps represented by Shadrapha, as depicted on the Amrit stela. The healing genius, according to its etymology, is depicted standing on a lion. In his right hand, he wields a club, and in his left hand, he holds another lion. The image is of an adult and fighting god, dressed in the Egyptian style, dominating over ferocious animals. It's so different from the iconography of the Egyptian shed as a child. If we had more cases like these, that is, a series of different images to compare in space and time, it would be very helpful for a better understanding of the divine figures. In short, the level of novelty and detail of the information the iconographies provide us with is generally very low, at best complementary to what can be deduced for the rest of the documentation. From a historical point of view, Phoenician city-states were the direct heir of the Syrian-Palestinian kingdoms of the late Bronze Age, of which they partially preserved organization, institution, and structure of the pantheon. Late Bronze territorial states had a national deity considered the honor of the country, flanked by a paredros or a paredra and a divine assembly. The same basic structure is detectable in the Iron Age Phoenician world. In turn, every Phoenician city had its own tutelary deities integrated into a cosmological universe. At the top, there was a divine couple, considered as the supernatural hypostasis of the human royal couple, consisting of a male god, whose identities varies from city to city, and a goddess, his spouse. The diversification we find, although within the framework of a shared tradition, were a powerful means of cultural identification, combining individual elements of a common code. It's appropriate to provide here a quick sketch of Phoenician deities in the Levant, whose cults follow the migrants in their Mediterranean adventures. In this regard, one might wonder what kind of devotion and cult the migrants brought with them on their journeys. Most of our direct Levantine sources emanated from an elite cult, rulers, nobles, high officials, which did not necessarily coincide with that of the migrants. However, although the latter certainly had own personal and family devotion, the differences with the elite don't appear to have been very great, or at least were unable to appreciate them, except for a few cases in personal names, which sometimes attest rare or archaic divine names. The gods who appear in the diaspora communities coincide more or less with those attested in the Levant, presumably in different assembled pantheons. We might then assume that the dynamism of multiple manifestation, modulated according to the specific need of the faithful, comes to play. Baal, for example, was a kind of passepartout designation that acquired various identities and colors when epithets and attribution intervene to specify its functions. Starting from North Phoenicia, an important cult place is located in the vicinity of Tartus at Amrit, where mainly therapeutic cults were practiced, implying the veneration of healing gods such as Shadrapha, Eshmun, and Melkart. In front of Tartus, on the island of Arwad, cults of various gods, known to us by the Greek names, are attested, which probably hide Semitic deities, such as, again, Melkart, Eshmun, Astarte, and maybe Bahamon. An established fact is the existence of a polyedic god, Baal Arwad, mainly characterized by marine features. According to classical tradition, Byblos was founded by Kronos, El, who made a certain Baltis, Lady of Byblos. In fact, according to Phoenician sources, the Byblian pantheon was dominated by a local Astarte called Lady, Balat Baltis, of Byblos. She was strongly influenced by the Egyptian goddesses Hathor, at first, then Isis, and lastly by Greek Aphrodite. The male element of the couple was perhaps a Baal of Byblos, called Adonis by the classical sources. Adonis is a Greek creation representing the ideal model of Phoenician polyedic god, protagonist of a tragic story of death transmitted in different mythological versions. In addition to the divine couple, the pantheon of Byblos included the sky god Baal-Shamem and a chthonic deity called Baladir. As for Beirut, a marine Baal was particularly venerated, identified with Poseidon by the classical sources. This god is also attested in the Hellenistic period when he was the patron of a congregation of Phoenician merchants, Poseidoniastes, living at Delos. Another deity associated with the sea was called Pontos by the classical sources. In the mountainous hinterland of Beirut, the cult of a god called Baal-Markod, perhaps Lord of the Danes, worshipped along with a mysterious goddess is attested. As for Sarepta, owing to its proximity to Sidon and Tyre, it's probable that it shared many of the religious traditions of the two major cities. Local epigraphic evidence mentions some deities, first of all Tinita Astarte, attested of an inscribed ivory plaque dating to the beginning of the 6th century BC, and possibly related to a shrine as yet unidentified. The healer god Shadrapha occurs in a dedicatory inscription dating back to the 4th century BC, and it's possible that Eshmun was also worshipped in a local sanctuary. Some Greek inscriptions mention a divine figure called Holy God of Sarepta, strongly characterized by therapeutic aspects and continued to be popular in Roman times. As for the precise identity of this god, it is probable that it was Ashmun, although Melkart is also a possibility. Regarding Sidon, cuneiform sources of the late Bronze Age attest that the local Baal was a storm god, venerated together with a goddess, probably Astarte, and this sanctuary enjoyed great prestige. Currently, during the Iron Age, Sidonian inscriptions of the Persian period testify to a divine couple consisting of a Baal of Sidon and Astarte at the top of the city's pantheon. But the most popular deity in this period seems to have been Ashmun, the healer god, bearing the epithet of Holy Prince. And it's probable the Baal of Sidon was nothing more than Ashmun himself, especially as Ashmun often occurs as a partner of Astarte, characterized by the epithet name of Baal. In the case of Ashmun, an evolution in the nature of this god must be presupposed, with a gradual increase in his healing functions. A famous cult place dedicated to Ashmun and Astarte was the above-mentioned sanctuary at Bustan Sheikh, at the mouth of the Awali River. This site was renowned for its therapeutic cults related to the waters of the river. According to epigraphic evidence, the territory of Sidon was divided into various districts following a spatial sacred topography: lofty skies, land of riches, Sidon rules, the precise meaning of which is unknown. As for the mythological tradition, late classical sources tell that Ashmun, Asmunos in Greek, was the protagonist of a dramatic tale similar to that of Adonis and with analogies with the story of the Phrygian Attis. As regards Tyre, also in this case, cuneiform texts for the Syrian area of the late Bronze Age testify to the cult of a divine couple consisting of a storm god and his spouse, a goddess of Astarte type. At the beginning of the Iron Age, a new major divine character emerges: Melkart, whose name clearly alludes to both his leading role at Tyre and his function as protector of the inhabitants. Also, as a result of these traits, Melkart was identified with Heracles, the Greek deified hero and founder of Calanis. Indeed, both the Phoenician god and the Greek hero have a mythological background characterized by an episode of death and return to life, as is also the case of Ashmun and Greek Asclepius, that certainly favored the conventions of the two deities and their perception in the popular imagination. In el-Ahmed, in the vicinity of Tyre, some dedicatory inscriptions provide evidence in the Hellenistic period of a temple of the god Milkastart, who was worshipped there together with Astarte and the messenger of angel of Miskaltart. It should be kept in mind that Tyre itself was the main protagonist of the Mediterranean expansion, promoting a large number of foundations in an extensive series of sites. First of all, Carthage. In each of them, religious conception originally borrowed from the homeland can be sometimes detected, even though destined to have autonomous developments and to be subject of external influences over time. We recall en passant the extraordinary variety of cult places found in Phoenician and Carthaginian settlements, places of worship built by men on the one hand, monumental in the conventional sense, such as temples and sanctuaries, sacred areas created in the open air, but with various installations, including the famous tophets, small chapels, altars, sacred pools, etc. And natural cult places, on the other hand, of various types in terms of morphology and location, mountain or sea caves, woods, springs, rivers, lakes, mountains, and various aids. Built places of worship were further characterized by their spatial location in relation to inhabited sanctuaries, urban, suburban, extra-urban, or totally peripheral to cities, but their more general geographical location was also characterizing insular, coastal, mountainous, etc. Each place of worship had one or more titular deities, which could be worshipped jointly or separately. In addition, cult places commonly referred to by Hebrew term Tophet should be noted as characteristic of the Phoenician and Punic peoples. Special infant shrines by incineration, intended to house the cremated remains of very young children, alone or together with the remains of lambs and kids, both sacrificial victims. As one would expect in the context of the Mediterranean expansion, the Tyrian Melkart was assigned the role of civilizing and founder god. At his side, or even often alone, there was Astarte, the goddess with 100 faces and manifestation, from a local Balat Loci to a specialized goddess. So far, pointing out the sporadic presence of Eshmun and other seemingly minor deities, we are dealing with the classical deities of the Phoenician polytheism, a few almost always in evidence. We know, however, that in Carthage, above all, and not only in the Tophet, two divine figures emerged apparently not very popular in Phoenicia, Balamon and Tinit. Yet their roots were in the Levant, and as far as Balamon is conceived, precisely in Tyre, just like Melkart. Not coincidentally, both gods are involved at various levels and with different functions in foundation processes, for example, Carthage and Cadiz, Gadir. The link with Tyre and the guardianship of the most sacred tradition, the protection of the city, family and offsprings in the migration experience, were distinctive yet partly shared aspects by the two gods. Basically, a dynamic role of explorer for Melkart, a more reassuring role of elder and wise protector for Balamon, not contraposition, but complementarity. As a couple, Balamon and Tinit symbolize the ancestral progenitors to which the faithful turn in the most important and critical moments of their life, within the Tophet cults, but also elsewhere. Both deities are invoked in thousands of dedications, mostly together and in that sequence. It is only from the 5th century BC onward that Tinit is found in the first place in invocation, but her divine husband continued to be considered the lord of the sanctuary. The rise, so to speak, of Tinit is probably motivated by the increasing importance of her role as tutelary numen of Carthage and mediator between her partner and humankind. Balamon was not the only deity of the Tophet. Of course, it was the titular deity of this special precinct, and for this aspect, it is known to us to a preeminent extent thanks to the exceptional visibility produced by the thousands of dedications in his honor. This should not, however, lead to the conclusion that where there was not Tophet, the cult of Balamon was lacking. In Carthage, Balamon was a full-fledged member of the pantheon. In addition to being defined as the fatherland god, it is at this temple that, at least according to Hanno's Periplus, the navigator would have deposited the account of his exploits, a gesture that would have been equally appropriate if carried out of the temple of Melkart. For her part, Tinit is a real enigma in terms of etymology, and not only. Goddess in her own right, or epithet, possibly a manifestation of someone else, Astarte, the good old Asherah of late Bronze Age. However things stand in this regard, Tinit mostly appears as a divine compassionate mother, identified with Juno Caelestis in Roman times. The popularity of the Carthaginian couple continued over time, even without being tied exclusively to the Tophet. In particular, the hair of Balamon, Saturn Kronos, and that of Tinit, Caelestis, became the most popular god in Romanized North African regions, possibly as representative of a special indigenous identity, characterized by different cultural roots, rather than the gods imported by the Romans. Otherwise, many other deities were venerated in Carthage, at different levels and in different layers of the population. Some of them were already familiar from the Levant, such as Astarte, Melkart, Reshef, Shadrafa, Sekon, while others are more obscure or attested only indirectly in theophoric names. The inscription also testified to the existence of priests and temples, the divine owners of which are mentioned: Astarte, Melkar, Eshmun, Milkastart, Hoter Miskar, Sakon, Sidinit, and Shamash. In addition, foreign deities, especially Egyptian and Greek, also enjoyed cult at Carthage. As for hierarchy of the Carthaginian pantheon, a well-known document is the Treaty of Alliance stipulated between Hannibal and Philip V of Macedonia in 215 BC, preserved by Polybius. Here we have a kind of official version of the Punic pantheon, with mention in Greek of the names of the Punic gods invoked as witnesses of the political agreement. It's not easy to identify the Punic deities concealed behind the Greek names, which are quoted in triads. The first triad is composed of Zeus, probably Balamon, followed by Hera, Tinit, and Apollo, maybe Eshmun. The second triad includes the daemon of Carthaginian, God, Heracles, Melkart, and Iolaos, whose identity is problematic. And the third triad consists of Ares, perhaps Reshef, and two maritime deities called respectively Triton and Poseidon. In terms of epigraphy, there is a dedicatory inscription that you can see here, commemorating the capture and destruction of Akragas by Carthage in 406–405 BC. But in addition to its exceptional historical value, this inscription is considerable from our point of view because it calls into question those who are the city's main deities: Tinit, Balamon, and Melkart, the elite of the pantheon, in continuity with the Tyrian tradition just evoked above. In other pantheon of Mediterranean Punic settlements, characters and ideologies of Phoenician and Carthaginian origin undergo autonomous development and change due to the external influence and indigenous tradition. On Cyprus, the kingdom of Kition, Larnaca, may be considered as a true Phoenician state tied to the homeland. Here Melkart, identified with a particular manifestation of Heracles, played the role of the polyedic god. as for other deities, Astarte on the one hand and a chef on the other enjoyed great veneration, also owing to their syncretism, respectively with Aphrodite, Paphos and Amatus, and Apollo. These Greek theonyms, in turn, conceal archaic Cypriot deities, thus confirming that we are dealing here with a stratified religious tradition. A different situation is attested in the Aegean area, where the Phoenicians were settled mainly as merchant communities. Their devotion to the gods of their homeland is well attested with a special tendency to venerate marine deities such as Baal of Berytus, Poseidon, and Astarte, Aphrodite Euploia, in addition to Melkar, Baal of Tyre, as Heracles, and the other Baals, usually called Zeus. On Malta, at Tassilge, a rock sanctuary bears witness to an extraordinary functional continuity over time. At the site, there is evidence of the cult of Astarte, possibly together with Melkart, from the archaic period, continuing the worship of a prehistoric mother goddess. As for Sicily, the Phoenician presence is limited to the western part of the territory, and especially to the small island of Mozia. Here, a Tophet precinct was installed almost from the very foundation of the built-up area, and Balamon was venerated as the sole recipient of the rites, while the cults of Astarte and perhaps Melkar are also attested on the island. On the island at Eryx, in Elimian territory, there was a mountain sanctuary dedicated to a local Astarte, identified with Aphrodite in Greek and Venus Erycina in Latin. This sacred place was famous in antiquity for its riches and the practice of sacred prostitution. Another very different cult places were located near Palermo, in the Grotta Regina. It was a maritime sanctuary mostly frequented by sailors, who left graffiti on the cave walls bearing dedication to Shadrapha and Isis. But more than any other Mediterranean region, Sardinia received and deeply assimilated Phoenician cultural tradition, both directly from the motherland and subsequently from Carthage, even if also influenced by indigenous substrates and later classical influence. Two of the most ancient known Tophets, at Sulci Sant'Antioco, founded about 750 BC, and Taros, early 7th century BC, were installed slightly after the foundation of both cities, in addition to others more or less contemporary, Bitia, or later, Nora, Cagliari, and Montesirai. In all these sites, Balamon was a patron of the cult place. Outside the Tophets, several other cults are also attested. Tinit, Melkar, Astarte, and Baal Shamem were worshipped in various parts of the island. In the sanctuary of Antas, in the interior, the god Sid was venerated and identified with Sardus Pater, an ancient indigenous character. And again at Antas, the either god Shadrapha and Horon were attested as mediators with the deus Loci. An important role was also played by Eshmun, often worshipped in cult places connected with springs and thermal waters. And finally, on the Iberian Peninsula, the cult of Tinit and Astarte seems to take on particular importance, judging by the wealth of evidence. Alongside these goddesses, also Balamon and, above all, Melkart enjoyed great veneration. A striking case is represented by the sanctuary of the latter at Gadir, a sort of counterpart to Melkar's sanctuary at Tyre, on the opposite shore of the Mediterranean. According to the classical authors, that sanctuary, not yet identified archaeological, was famous and overflowing with riches, and the site of an oracle consulted by important people throughout history. And again, not far from Gadi, a marine and oracular Astarte were worshipped in a cave. And on the island of Ibiza, the cave on Esculleram housed another important cult place dedicated to a goddess, Tinit, where hundreds of votive statues have come to light. The next panel proposed in schematic terms a sort of model of a Phoenician god, recalling that on the one hand, there are generic theonyms, passepartout, which acquire a certain meaning when specified by epithets, while others, on the other hand, offer a possible etymology, useful but not always decisive for delving into individual characters. To sum up, in an old article of mine on Phoenician religion, I noted the rather limited number of deities mentioned in the inscription who ended up reappearing almost everywhere. I hypothesized that we were moving towards a partial disintegration of that polytheistic system. A clue was perhaps the double divine names, result of theocracy, divine fusions, which saw powers and function increasingly concentrated in single deities. But also the growing popularity and spread of healing cults, a pan-Mediterranean trend, seemed to me both cause and consequence of that phenomenon, bearing in mind that polytheism and monotheism are tendential forms, never drastically opposable. Many years later, this general assessment does not seem unfounded to me, especially if we holistically reconsidered the cultural and religious climate that was taking place in the middle of the first millennium BC in the Mediterranean area. While I do not recognize myself in Karl Jasper's Axenzeit, which remains, in my opinion, a philosophical theorization and does not exist as an epochal break, that historical period undoubtedly marks a great cultural upheaval, which, among other things, leads to the emergence and consolidation of monotheistic conceptions. In the continuous and optimistic wait for new sources that expand our knowledge, the theoretical plan can continue to be expressed, but always with great caution. Thank you very much.